To all who come to this happy place, welcome. Disneyland is your land.
One thing that he insisted upon was that there be a very, very conspicuous castle, because the castle is going to be the symbol of this whole place.
Let's travel back to the 1940s and experience the history and beginnings of Disneyland, starting with the center of attention herself, Sleeping Beauty Castle. In the early plannings of Disneyland, many map designs didn't include a castle at all, but rather the feel of a castle. This was purposely done by Walt because he didn't want his theme park to be overwhelmed by a large object and rather to be more intimate. In fact, it wasn't until 1943 that Walt would task the job of designing the castle to his longtime friend, Herb Ryman. Walt Disney and legendary Imagineer Marvin Davis, the scenic designer for Disney, would travel around the world sightseeing different castles, eventually falling in love with the Neuschwanstein Castle and the Notre Dame Castle, which they would use the chapel for on Sleeping Beauty Castle. Early on in designing the castle, Walt would consider a medieval castle, but eventually would change his mind to a fairy tale Fantasyland castle. Imagineer Fred Jorger would design the first 3D model of Sleeping Beauty Castle. It is said that one day, while in a meeting, Herbie Ryman flipped the castle around to try and get a different view while Walt was out. He forgot about it when Walt walked back in, and eventually Walt would look at it and say, "I like that better," and that's how we see the back of Sleeping Beauty Castle today. The castle's construction, for the most part, was built similar to any other modern-day building, packed with dirt and then built up with scrim. However, much ahead of its time, the castle uses fiberglass for the castle circles. The towers of the castle were built off-site and taken into the park close to the castle's finish. Another shocking aspect of the castle's build is that stucco was used to create the specter of brick walls. Early on, Walt left the castle incomplete because he often said Disneyland will never be complete as long as there is imagination left in the world, and he originally always wanted there to be some part of Disneyland left to build. It would be finished in the 1990s. The opening day for the park was growing dangerously near, yet the castle still didn't have a paint scheme or a name. Directions were hastily given to the workers to paint the castle, and even on opening day, the name of the castle was confusing. Many people called it the Fantasyland Castle. It is even said that in early marketing, Walt once called it Snow White's Castle, eventually choosing on Sleeping Beauty Castle because it was the nearest princess movie to come out, a clever marketing scheme that he decided on that would later pay off. With many other opening day disasters, one of the main issues were the swans and the moats. They enjoyed the plants around, and the moats became quickly infested throughout the day, eventually causing the Imagineers to change the plants over to junipers, which they would not eat. The swans can be considered as the original Disneyland ducks. Being a man who hated to waste space, Walt decided shortly after the opening that something needed to go inside the castle's extra space. Eventually, he would decide on a walkthrough for Sleeping Beauty, even though it would not open for another 4 years. One day, Walt would go up to the castle to find 100 feral cats, and he would make sure that every single one of them were groomed and found a home, including keeping one for himself. The task of designing the walkthrough would go to Edmund Earle and Ken Anderson. Originally, the walkthrough would consist of mostly plywood cutouts. Although at one point you were supposed to enter to the castle balcony in the walkthrough, the idea would eventually be scrapped. The walkthrough would open in 1957, Its opening day would be attended by a now grown-up Shirley Temple and Walt Disney himself. Our beloved walkthrough would see its first overhaul in the late 1970s. More 3D models would be added, and it would be changed around to be more like the movie and a lot more lighthearted. You would also see a true love's first kiss for the very first time. The attraction would suddenly close in 2001, shortly after 9/11. It wouldn't reopen until 2008. However, when it did, Tony Baxter and his team of Imagineers had completely gutted the entire thing and started from scratch with some of the best technology at the time. The castle would remain mostly unchanged for the next 50 years, minus seasonal changes, anniversary changes, and other special events. In 2015, the 60th anniversary Diamond Celebration would bring us a whole new castle and a whole new look. Blue banners and a dazzling roof, and we all remember those cones that they thankfully eventually took down. This castle would remain throughout the entirety of the 60th anniversary of Disneyland. The castle would go back to normal until 2018, when it would go down for a 6-month renovation. This would be the most extensive renovation to date, with a new paint job and new tiling. No matter how many times she has changed or will change in the future, just as Walt has always wanted, Sleeping Beauty Castle will always be there to welcome you home.